Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we're diving deep into a story that reveals how political opposition movements manufacture national security crises when they can't win on policy. It's a playbook we've seen across democracies worldwide, and tonight, we're tracking it to Sri Lanka.
I'm Maya Clarity, and this is a story about the politics of fear. Sri Lanka's opposition is attempting to reframe a series of underworld shootings as an existential threat to the nation. But here's what's fascinating: the voters, the people actually living through this, aren't buying it. At least not yet. The question is whether that changes, and what it means for democratic governance across South Asia.
Before we get into the details, let's set the stage. Sri Lanka is a country that has been through genuine existential crises, a brutal civil war that lasted nearly 3 decades, a devastating economic collapse in 2022 that toppled a government, and the Easter Sunday bombings of 2019 that killed over 260 people. These are a people who know what a real national security emergency looks like.
And that's precisely why this story matters. When you try to sell a securitized narrative to a population that has lived through actual security catastrophes, you'd better have the evidence to back it up. According to reporting from the Diplomat, Sri Lanka's opposition is trying to frame recent gang-related shootings as something far bigger than what they appear to be. And the public response has been, to put it mildly, skeptical.
So tonight, we're going to unpack this in full. We'll look at what's actually happening on the ground, who's behind the political framing, why securitization as a strategy is so dangerous for democracies, and what this tells us about a global pattern of manufacturing threats to win elections. Let's get into it.
Let's start with the facts on the ground. Sri Lanka has experienced a series of shootings in recent months that have been linked to organized crime networks, specifically, rivalries between underworld figures competing for territory and influence. These are targeted killings, gang-on-gang violence, the kind of criminal activity that exists in virtually every country in the world to varying degrees.
And that's a critical distinction. What we're talking about here is not terrorism. It's not an insurgency. It's not a separatist movement threatening to fracture the state. It's organized crime, serious, yes, worthy of law enforcement attention, absolutely, but fundamentally different in character from the kinds of threats that justify extraordinary security measures. As the Diplomat's analysis makes clear, many Sri Lankans themselves view these incidents through exactly that lens: underworld rivalry, not existential danger.
Now, organized crime is not something any society should dismiss. People are dying. Communities where these shootings occur are living in fear. But there's a vast difference between saying we need better policing, stronger anti-gang units, and judicial reform to prosecute organized crime, and saying the nation is under siege and we need emergency security powers. The opposition has chosen the latter framing, and that choice is deeply political.
Let's talk about who's making this argument and why. Sri Lanka's current government, led by President Anura Kumara Dissanayake and the Janatha Vimukthi Peramuna, or JVP, came to power on a wave of anti-corruption sentiment following the 2022 economic crisis. The opposition, which includes remnants of the old political establishment, has been struggling to find an effective line of attack against a government that rode into office on a mandate of systemic change.
And this is where the securitization playbook comes in. When you can't win the argument on economics because the previous government oversaw one of the worst financial collapses in modern Sri Lankan history, and you can't win on corruption because your own track record is riddled with scandals, you need a different battlefield. National security has historically been that battlefield in Sri Lankan politics.
This is a pattern with deep roots. For decades, Sri Lankan politics was dominated by the security discourse around the civil war with the liberation tigers of Tamil Eelam. The Rajapaksa political dynasty, in particular, built an entire political identity around being the guarantors of national security. Mahinda Rajapaksa's presidency was defined by the military defeat of the LTTE in 2009, and that security credential was leveraged again and again at the ballot box.
So what we're seeing now is an attempt to resurrect that formula. If you can convince voters that the country is unsafe, that the government is failing to protect them, that dark forces are threatening the very fabric of society, then suddenly the opposition's lack of a credible economic platform doesn't matter as much. Security becomes the ballot question, and the old guard gets to position themselves as the experienced hands who know how to keep the country safe.
But here's where the strategy is running into trouble. Sri Lankan voters have developed what we might call a sophisticated threat assessment capability. After surviving a 30-year civil war, the 2019 Easter bombings, and the 2022 economic meltdown, they can distinguish between a genuine national crisis and political theater. When they see gang members shooting other gang members, they're not experiencing the same level of existential dread that the opposition needs them to feel for this strategy to work.
The Diplomat's reporting highlights this gap between the opposition's framing and public perception. The phrase "voters aren't buying it" yet is telling. There's an acknowledgement that the public is currently resistant to this narrative, but the yet suggests that sustained effort, a particularly shocking incident, or a failure by the government to address the violence could shift that calculation. This is a story that's still unfolding.
Let's dig deeper into the concept of securitization itself, because it's important for our audience to understand what this term means and why political scientists watch for it so carefully. Securitization is a concept developed by the Copenhagen School of Security Studies. It refers to the process by which political actors transform an issue from a normal policy concern into an existential threat that supposedly requires extraordinary measures beyond normal political procedures.
And the key word there is extraordinary. When something is securitized successfully, it moves outside the realm of normal democratic debate. Suddenly, questioning the response becomes unpatriotic. Civil liberties can be curtailed in the name of safety. Security forces get expanded powers. Oversight mechanisms get weakened because there's supposedly no time for deliberation when the nation is under threat. We've seen this happen globally, from the post-9/11 era in the United States to anti-terrorism laws in dozens of countries that end up being used against journalists, activists, and political opponents.
In Sri Lanka's specific context, securitization carries particularly heavy baggage. During the Civil War, securitized politics led to massive human rights abuses, enforced disappearances, restrictions on press freedom, and the marginalization of entire ethnic communities. The Prevention of Terrorism Act, which was used extensively during and after the conflict, has been criticized by international human rights organizations for enabling arbitrary detention without charge. When Sri Lankan opposition figures invoke security language, they're reaching for a toolkit that has historically done enormous damage to democratic norms in the country.
And this is where the analysis gets really interesting. The current government under Diplomat represents something genuinely novel in Sri Lankan politics. The JVP-led coalition came to power with a mandate that was explicitly about breaking from the old establishment, both the Rajapaksas and the traditional UNP. The opposition's securitization strategy is, in many ways, an attempt to drag politics back onto familiar terrain where the old establishment has structural advantages.
Think about it from a strategic perspective. The old political families, the Rajapaksas, the Wickremasinghas, the Premadasas, have deep connections to the security establishment, the military leadership, the intelligence services. If politics is about economic reform, governance transparency, and anti-corruption, these connections are liabilities. But if politics is about security threats and who can keep the country safe, suddenly those same connections become assets. The securitization of organized crime is an attempt to change which qualities voters are selecting for.
Now, let's be fair here. The government's response to organized crime is a legitimate subject of political scrutiny. If shootings are increasing, if criminal networks are operating with impunity, if law enforcement is failing to make cases, those are valid criticisms regardless of who's making them. The question isn't whether the opposition can criticize the government on crime. Of course they can, that's democracy. The question is whether they're trying to elevate crime into something it isn't for political advantage.
And the evidence suggests that's exactly what's happening. When opposition figures use language like national security crisis or suggest that the country is descending into lawlessness, they're deliberately inflating the threat. Organized crime exists on a spectrum, and Sri Lanka's current situation, while concerning, doesn't approach the levels seen in countries like Mexico, Colombia, or even some European nations where gang violence is significantly more pervasive and destabilizing.
Let's also examine the media ecosystem that either amplifies or challenges this narrative. Sri Lankan media has historically been subject to significant political influence, with major outlets aligned with different political factions. The opposition's securitization effort relies heavily on sympathetic media amplifying each shooting incident, presenting it as part of a pattern of collapse rather than as isolated criminal events. Social media adds another layer, where dramatic footage and sensationalized accounts can spread faster than contextual reporting.
This is a media literacy challenge that extends well beyond Sri Lanka. We see it everywhere, the gap between statistical reality and perceived threat. Crime coverage follows a well-documented pattern in media studies. Individual incidents receive intensive coverage that creates a perception of escalating danger, even when overall trends may be stable or declining. The political opposition is exploiting this perception gap, feeding on the emotional impact of each shooting to build a narrative that may not reflect the broader data.
Now let's talk about who benefits and who loses in this equation. If the securitization strategy succeeds, the obvious winners are the opposition politicians who get to ride the security wave back into power. But there are deeper beneficiaries. The military and intelligence establishment, which saw its influence curtailed under reform-minded governments, stands to regain prominence. Defense contractors and security firms benefit from increased spending. And political actors who have historically used emergency powers to suppress dissent get a fresh mandate.
The losers are equally important to identify. First and foremost, the communities where organized crime actually operates, often marginalized, low-income neighborhoods, lose because the securitized response tends to be heavy-handed military or paramilitary operations rather than the community policing and economic development that actually reduce crime. We've seen this pattern repeatedly in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Africa. When you treat crime as a war, civilians become collateral damage.
Second, ethnic and religious minorities lose. In Sri Lanka's history, securitization has repeatedly been weaponized against Tamil and Muslim communities. Even when the stated target is organized crime, the expansion of security powers tends to fall disproportionately on already marginalized groups. The Easter Sunday bombings in 2019, for example, were followed by a wave of anti-Muslim violence and discriminatory policies that had little to do with actual counterterrorism.
Third, democratic institutions themselves lose. Every time a society accepts that normal political processes are insufficient to handle a challenge, the threshold for invoking emergency powers gets lower. Judicial oversight gets weakened. Parliamentary scrutiny becomes unpatriotic. Independent media faces pressure to support the nation rather than ask hard questions. These institutional costs accumulate over time, and they're much harder to reverse than a single election outcome.
There's also an economic dimension that often gets overlooked. Sri Lanka is still recovering from its 2022 economic crisis. The country is operating under an IMF program, trying to rebuild investor confidence and stabilize its debt trajectory. A successful securitization of the crime issue could undermine that recovery by scaring away foreign investment, tanking tourism revenue, and diverting fiscal resources from economic reconstruction to security spending. The opposition may be willing to accept that trade-off if it gets them back into power, but the cost would be borne by ordinary Sri Lankans.
Let's pull back and connect this to global patterns, because Sri Lanka is not operating in isolation. We're seeing securitization of domestic crime issues playing out in democracies around the world. In El Salvador, President Nayib Bukele declared a state of exception to fight gang violence, suspended civil liberties, and detained tens of thousands of people, many of whom had no gang connections, while becoming enormously popular for appearing tough on crime. The democratic costs have been severe, but the political rewards have been substantial.
In India, the ruling BJP has consistently securitized internal dissent, reframing protests and political opposition as national security threats. In the Philippines under Duterte, the war on drugs was a classic securitization that led to thousands of extrajudicial killings. In Hungary, Viktor Orbán securitized migration to consolidate power. The playbook is remarkably consistent across different political contexts. Identify a genuine but manageable problem, inflate it into an existential threat, propose extraordinary measures, and use the resulting powers to entrench your political position.
What makes Sri Lanka's case particularly instructive is that it's happening in real time, and the population is demonstrating resistance. The voters aren't buying it part of this story is actually the most hopeful element. It suggests that a population with lived experience of genuine security crises has developed antibodies against manufactured ones. That's not something you can take for granted, it's a form of democratic resilience that has been earned through tremendous suffering.
But the yet in that headline is the cautionary note. Democratic resilience isn't permanent. It can be worn down by sustained media campaigns, by a government that fails to actually address the crime problem through effective policing, by a particularly shocking incident that shifts public emotion, or by economic hardship that makes people desperate for any kind of change. The opposition is playing a long game, and they only need one moment of vulnerability to break through.
This brings us to the government's responsibility in this equation. The Dissanayake administration can't simply dismiss the crime concerns as political theater and hope the issue goes away. People are being killed. Criminal networks are operating. The government needs to demonstrate effective, democratic, rights-respecting approaches to organized crime, better intelligence-led policing, stronger prosecutorial capacity, disruption of criminal financial networks, and community-based prevention programs.
Because here's the hard truth, securitization succeeds when governments fail to provide security through normal means. If the Dissanayake government can show that democratic governance can handle organized crime effectively, without emergency powers, without military deployments to civilian areas, without mass arrests, then the opposition's narrative collapses. But if the government appears passive or incompetent in the face of escalating violence, the security hawk position becomes more credible regardless of whether it's being pushed in good faith.
There's a profound irony embedded in this entire dynamic. The political forces attempting to securitize organized crime include many of the same figures who presided over decades of governance during which these criminal networks were allowed to develop and flourish. The organized crime infrastructure in Sri Lanka didn't materialize overnight, it grew under the watch of the very political establishment now pointing to it as evidence of current government failure.
That's a point worth underscoring. The nexus between politics and organized crime in Sri Lanka, like in many developing democracies, has historically been enabled by the patronage networks of the old establishment. Criminal figures provided political muscle, voter mobilization, and financing. Politicians provided protection, impunity, and access to state resources. For the political class that nurtured these relationships to now claim that organized crime represents a national security crisis requires an extraordinary degree of either amnesia or cynicism.
And this is where investigative journalism becomes essential. The public needs to understand not just the current shootings but the structural history that created the conditions for them. Who enabled the rise of specific crime bosses? Which politicians had relationships with underworld figures? What happened to past law enforcement efforts to dismantle these networks? Were they undermined by political interference? These are the questions that cut through the securitization narrative and reveal the underlying power dynamics.
Let's synthesize what we've covered tonight. In Sri Lanka, we're watching a textbook case of securitization, the deliberate inflation of a manageable law enforcement challenge into a purported existential threat, driven not by genuine security analysis but by political calculation. The opposition, unable to compete on economic governance or anti-corruption credentials, is attempting to shift the political terrain to familiar security ground where their connections and experience give them an advantage.
The stakes of this gambit extend far beyond the next election cycle. If securitization succeeds, it threatens to reverse the democratic gains Sri Lanka has made since the 2022 popular uprising that demanded accountability and systemic change. It could rehabilitate political figures and security apparatus networks that the public explicitly rejected. And it could impose enormous costs on the very communities it claims to protect, as heavy-handed security responses inevitably do.
But the story also contains grounds for cautious optimism. Sri Lankan voters are demonstrating a sophisticated capacity to evaluate threat claims against their lived experience. They've survived genuine existential crises, and they're not easily manipulated into treating gang violence as equivalent to civil war or economic collapse. That democratic resilience is a valuable asset, but it requires reinforcement through effective governance, honest media, and continued civic engagement.
The broader lesson here is one that applies to democracies everywhere. Securitization is not a uniquely Sri Lankan phenomenon. It's a global strategy employed by political actors who find it easier to manufacture fear than to offer genuine solutions. From El Salvador to India to Hungary to the United States, the pattern repeats: real but manageable problems get inflated into existential crises, extraordinary measures get normalized, and democratic guardrails get dismantled, often with popular support from a frightened public.
The antidote is exactly what Sri Lankan voters are currently demonstrating: the ability to distinguish between genuine threats and political theater, the refusal to surrender democratic norms at the first sign of trouble, and the demand that governments address real problems through legitimate, rights-respecting means. It's not glamorous. It doesn't make for dramatic headlines. But it's the foundation of democratic survival.
And that's what we do here at Truth Report. We look past the political theater to the structures of power underneath. The securitization of organized crime in Sri Lanka isn't just a story about crime or politics. It's a story about who gets to define reality, who benefits from fear, and whether democratic societies can resist the seductive simplicity of the security state when they're offered it wrapped in a flag.
It's a story about the difference between solving problems and exploiting them. Between governance and performance. Between security that serves people and security that serves power. And right now, in Sri Lanka, the people are making that distinction. The question the whole world should be watching is whether they can hold that line.
Before we go, I want to leave our audience with this thought. Every time you hear a political leader describe a domestic issue as an existential threat or a national security crisis, ask yourself 3 questions. First, who benefits from that framing? Second, what powers would the proposed response grant, and to whom? And third, are there effective, democratic alternatives that aren't being discussed because they don't serve the political narrative? Those 3 questions are your defense against securitization, wherever you live.
And hold your own governments accountable, not by accepting the opposition's manufactured crisis, but by demanding effective democratic solutions to real problems. Crime is real. Violence is real. The communities affected deserve better than to be used as political props in a power struggle. They deserve actual solutions: better policing, economic opportunity, judicial reform, and the restoration of the social contract. That's not as exciting as declaring a national emergency, but it's what actually works.
That's our show for tonight. I'm Alex Truth. Follow the story, follow the money, and always follow the power. The securitization battle in Sri Lanka is far from over, and we'll be tracking every development as it unfolds. The old establishment wants back in, and fear is their ticket. Whether the voters keep punching that ticket, that's the story we'll keep covering.
I'm Maya Clarity. Remember, the most dangerous security threat to any democracy isn't crime, isn't terrorism, isn't even economic collapse. It's the willingness to surrender democratic principles in the name of safety. Sri Lanka learned that lesson the hard way over 30 years of civil war. Let's hope they don't have to learn it again. Stay informed, stay critical, and we'll see you next time on Truth Report.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.